For our last section on observational learning, we're going to be talking about the principles and applications as well as a history of the research regarding observational learning. Um, Observational learning is a type of learning that we use very often, especially because we are a very social species. We learn by watching other people do things. This picture is kind of cute here. You see a mom on her computer and her cell phone, and you see her little girl who's dressed like her, sitting like her, and talking on the phone just like her. Looks like she's trying to get work done as well, maybe pretending to take the phone call. Little kids will do this quite a bit. I actually have a video in the playlist of a little girl who's talking on the phone, and she's doing the hand gestures and the facial gestures and like the intonation patterns that probably mimic what she's heard her mom doing while she's been talking on the phone. So take a look at that. This is a form of observational learning and one of the really cute consequences of it. So when we're doing this higher order learning, we kind of break this down into two sections. We have what's called rote learning, and that's learning that takes place mechanically through repetition and memorization, and by learning basic rules. So when you've learned your timetables, maybe in math class when you were younger, if you had to do it going, 3 times 7 is 21, 2 times 7 is 14, and like having to just like drill your times tables, that's, this rote learning style. Discovery learning, on the other hand, is learning based off of insight and understanding, using games to teach, manipulation tools, discussion, lab experiments. These type of techniques are a more interactive form of learning, and it helps people make new connections on their own without actually being forced into one pathway of learning. All right, so we're going to be talking for a little while about Albert Bandura's work. And before I start, I want to kind of have you think for a second about what happens when you watch aggression on TV. So if you watch, say, a boxing match or an MMA fight, maybe you've seen a fight in a hockey game or during a baseball game, or you've watched football, how do you feel afterwards? Do you feel relaxed and less aggressive than before you started? Or do you maybe feel hyped up and like ready, like, hey, I could fight someone right now? Depending on how you feel, it says a whole lot about this type of research. So you very likely, especially after watching something like an MMA fight or a fight in a hockey game, you probably feel more hyped up yourself. And this is something that we kind of know intuitively, but the interesting thing is that people up until the 1960s actually thought it was the opposite. So people used to believe that by watching a boxing match or other violence, you would be purged of your violent tendencies. Essentially, by watching it, you were relieved yourself and you didn't have to feel like you needed to fight. So it was actually encouraged people to watch violent sports, and even for kids to watch violent things because it would purge them of their violent tendencies. Now, we probably understand intuitively today that that's not the case, but no one was thinking about that at the time. So Albert Bandura wanted to do some research, and he decided to do it with children because he thought they might be more impressionable. And what he did is he had kids watching a person, an adult, in another room. So they had like a one-way mirror. So they could look through the mirror at the adult playing in the room. And the adult would either play very nicely with all the toys, in particular, this blow-up inflatable clown doll called the Bobo doll. The thing with the Bobo doll is if you hit it, it bounces back up. So it's weighted on the bottom. So it's kind of a fun punching toy. The little kids either watch the adult play calmly with the toys, in particular the Bobo doll, or they watch the adult beat up the Bobo doll very aggressively and using other toys like hammers and cars and toy guns to really beat on that doll really, really badly. In the cases where the kids watched the adult play calmly, when they were let into the room to play, they too played calmly. But if they watched the adult be aggressive, they mimicked the actions of the adult, in particular using the same toys to beat on the Bobo doll, or using the similar techniques of throwing or kicking, and the children would mimic them. And this was the first instance of actually showing that aggression can be learned through observation. And then he was curious to see what happened if the children watched this adult on TV and not in person. Now, in the 1960s, TV was starting to come into the household for the very first time. And there was a plethora of shows like westerns and superhero shows that were actually geared more towards children, and these often featured aggressive action. So if you think of the old kiddie westerns, they would have shooting and they would have people beating up the bad guys, or superheroes beating up the bad guys. And Bandura looked to see if kids could learn aggression through TV. And his results, when he showed the kids, the adults beating up the Bobo doll on TV, they still mimicked the actions. They even did like a fantasy version of it where the adult was dressed up as a big cat, thinking, okay, maybe a cartoonish version won't cause the same results, but it did. So if kids were watching the adult on TV, even dressed up in a silly costume, they were more likely to mimic it. So this really showed for the first time that aggression can be learned, and aggression can be a learned thing through television, so through a screen. And this really changed how people viewed aggression, as well as television that was geared towards children. So you actually saw a shift in the 1970s and 1980s where aggression on TV was kind of toned down if it was geared towards children. So superheroes would use their intelligence or out manipulate or trick the bad guy instead of beating up the bad guy. And you see this a lot in the cartoons of the 80s. If you think of like the Scooby-Doo shows, they never have to beat up the monster. They always trip him, or they somehow trick him into revealing himself. So the pathway for this this observational learning has to do with the model or the person who's serving as the example within the situation of observational learning. Observational learning is considered watching and imitating the actions of another person or noting the consequences of those actions. You have to either do it through direct experience or by observation, so somehow watching the other person. And there's several steps that have to take place. You have to pay attention, you have to remember, and then reproduce and practice that behavior. And you have to have that model there in place or somewhere for us to follow. So again, we're going to be going through these steps: attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So first, the first step is attention. The observer must first pay attention to the model's behavior before he or she can model it. Research shows that children tend to model their behavior after people who are warm, nurturing, successful, and powerful. This is a really key thing. The model changes the replicability or the durability of the observational learning depending on some of their key features. So typically, they'll go for people who are, more successful, more powerful. Children will typically, and adults will model people who are older than them. Like, for example, it'd be weird for me to model my behavior after Kylie Jenner, but maybe I'm going to model my behavior after a celebrity who's older than myself or closer to the same age, so either the same age or older. I'm not going to model someone who's a lot younger than myself. We typically are going to look at people who are, again, more successful than us. So I'm going to find someone who I'm not going to model my behavior after a loser friend of mine. I'm going to look at someone who has more power or is in a better career than myself, and I'll model their behavior. We also typically will model the behaviors of someone who is our same sex versus the opposite sex. But that can change, especially when it relates to maybe career advice. And you guys may think that this is kind of silly, but if you think about it, like Instagram influencers, YouTube stars, they are people who are paid to influence your behavior. And so you observe what they're doing, whether it's the products they buy, the makeup that they use, the clothing, or just silly things that they do, different tricks or, fads. You guys have heard of the Tide Pod challenge and things like that. We model their behaviors because they are considered to be successful within the realm that they're in. So, they're a popular YouTube star and they're making money for that. You'll see children on the playground who are modeling the behavior of their favorite cartoon characters. As we age and mature, we tend to seek out models that are similar to us in some way. So they might be the same race, they might be the same age, they may be in the same career path, and we find models that are somehow similar to us. You'll see little kids on the playground though, like they'll run around and be like, "I'm Superman," and be running around with their arms in front of them like they're flying, and they'll do Superman's favorite moves or Batman, whatever they're really into. Retention also has to occur in memory. So the observer has to retain a cognitive representation or memory of that model's behavior. For children in the playground to model the behavior of the TV characters, they actually have to have the memories of what they previously saw on TV. So if they weren't paying attention and they didn't remember what they did, obviously there's no way for them to replicate that behavior if they don't remember what they're supposed to do. Then they have to reproduce the behavior. The observer has to have a mental representation of the behavior stored in memory, and then the person has to have the physical ability to actually reproduce the behavior if modeling is to occur. So, for example, a child can remember a superhero flying. The child will not be able to fly themselves, but they'll be able to model an approximation. So they may jump off of things to say that they're flying, or again, they'll put their arms in front of them and run around really fast with like a cape on, and that'll be flying. But obviously, they're not actually going to be able to fly. And motivation. So after retrieving the memory of the behavior and figuring out how to produce the behavior, the observer must be motivated to actually execute the behavior. As we saw the Bobo doll experiments, the observer may sometimes not want to execute the behavior. This is especially true if the observer believes that the execution of the behavior may lead to punishment. So a little kid on the playground, they may want to, show off their Superman moves, but if they know they're going to get in trouble from their teacher, they may not do it. Now, another thing with modeling that can occur is that we can or observational learning is we can look at someone and actually realize that we don't want to do that behavior because they got in trouble for it. So I think of a little kid watching their friend do Superman's moves. Their friend gets in trouble, so they're less likely to do it themselves. Same thing can happen if you have an older sibling who's done poorly in school or done some illegal activity and gotten in trouble, you're less likely to replicate their behavior because you saw the consequences of those actions. So I want you guys to briefly think about how media can influence children's behaviors. So think about violent shows and violent video games. I know a lot of the people who play video games have usually really strong viewpoints that violent video games don't cause people to be aggressive because they themselves are generally not aggressive. But there's overwhelming research at this point that does show that playing violent video games, especially from a young age, not necessarily starting in your teens, but starting at a very young age, does lead children to be more aggressive. If you don't believe me, there's an excellent research article on our Canvas page under modules that goes through this. It's actually a meta-analysis of a bunch of research on this topic, and there really does seem to be overwhelming evidence that playing violent video games seems to influence children's violent behaviors. Violent video games seem to be more impactful than TV shows, probably because the person playing the game actually directs the actions of the gameplay. So they're actually maybe leading the actions versus just watching, a movie on TV where there's violence. I know you guys probably may be a little skeptical of this still, but please go and check that out. And again, I'm not talking about you as a teenager being terribly influenced, but I'm talking about young kids, 6-year-olds who are playing things like Grand Theft Auto or Black Ops and things like that. They're being exposed to things at a very young age that are not appropriate for them. They don't know the difference between what's real and what's fake. And that's also kind of going to the second point. We all have witnessed thousands of murders, robberies, assaults, torturings, beatings on TV. If you watch most popular TV shows and movies, but we're not all violent maniacs because we have higher order thinking and consciousness processes that enable us to understand what is real and what is fake and what we can and cannot do. But little kids don't have those filters kind of built in. Also, if there's moderating effects such as abuse in the household, or mental health disturbances in the child, that can lead them to have inappropriate awareness of what's right and wrong. So we have to keep these effects in mind. And this is one of the reasons we have ratings for TV shows and for movies and for video games. You have the E for everyone games. You have the ones that are for, this is for teenagers, and the ones that are, these are for adults only. And little kids should be monitored as to what they're playing. It actually seems that observational learning may actually come from a basic neurological level. So we actually have what are called mirror neurons in our brains that when we watch someone do an activity, our mirror neurons actually mirror that action in our brain without physically doing it. So you see the little baby monkey here. If the adult sticks their tongue out at them, then they'll stick their tongue out back. Human infants also generally imitate the actions of adults in their environment. So they'll begin to imitate almost from birth. But if you've ever seen, if you watch the Olympics or you watch like the X Games and you see these crazy things going on TV, your brain, you may actually kind of, consciously be more aware of this, of like, oh man, how would I do that with my body? How would I do that flip or something? And that's kind of your mirror neurons at work, trying to figure out how you could physically do that action. So here's a quick review of the 3 styles of learning we've talked about today. We have classical conditioning, which is when a neutral stimulus is associated with a natural response, such as a reflex. Operant conditioning is a response that is increased or decreased due to reinforcement or punishment. So voluntary actions, either increasing or decreasing based off the consequences. And then observational learning is learning that occurs through observation and imitation of others. All right, that's the end of chapter 6. Thank you so much.